So hello, everyone. Good afternoon. Thank you so much for coming. My name is Pauline Jones. I'm the director of the International Institute, and I'm also a faculty affiliate of the Weiser Center for Emerging Democracies. And it is my sincere pleasure today to introduce to you our speaker, Margaret Hansen, Dr. Margaret Hansen. She is a Weiser Emerging Democracies postdoctoral fellow this year for the 2017-2018 year. This is a very competitive, very prestigious fellowship. We have hundreds of applications, so it's really, again, a very prestigious fellowship. And that said, Margaret received her PhD from Ohio State University, so we have to overlook that. But she is a Michigander, so we know that yeah, she's solid UM. And she received her PhD, and I was very lucky, very honored to be able to serve as one of the members of her dissertation committee. She wrote an excellent dissertation, and that dissertation landed her an excellent job, not just this postdoc, but also an excellent job as an assistant professor at Arizona State University, which she will be starting in September of 2018. So very proud of Margaret and very happy for her, and very excited to hear about her talk today. Her research generally focuses on institutions that help autocracies endure. Specifically, she examines how formal and informal institutions interact to shape governance in authoritarian regimes. Usually we focus a lot on democratic regimes and institutions of democracies, but there's this sort of new burgeoning literature that Margaret's very much part of that is exploring how autocracies endure and how institutions actually, legalistic institutions, right, formal institutions actually help autocracies endure. And she's a leading scholar not just of these sort of institutions and autocracies, but also of Central Asia, particularly Kazakhstan, where her empirical work focuses. So broadly, she focuses on authoritarian stability, governance, development, but with an emphasis on the former Soviet Union and Kazakhstan. Today, she's going to present part of her core research project. Her talk is entitled Civil Courts and Authoritarian Stability. And I know she's very much looking forward to your questions and comments, so thank you very much for coming. And thank you, Margaret, for sharing your research with us.
Thank you, Paul. They already have me mic'd up, so.
Okay, great.
All right, so thank you, Pauline, for that introduction. Hopefully I live up to it, and thank you all for coming. I'm excited to see so many people who are interested in, I'm assuming, either Kazakhstan or dictatorships, both of which I think are really cool topics. The project I'll be discussing today addresses an issue that's integral to understanding why some personalist dictatorships endure over the long run, and that is how they manage the myriad regional and local officials who together comprise the state. So in other words, it speaks to the principal-agent problems that are inherent in authoritarian governance. And while, of course, these types of problems exist in many different contexts, they're a particularly vexing problem in non-democracies, where the constant threat of, and very real threat of repression means that individuals have every incentive to tell the dictator what he wants to hear rather than the truth, which in turn makes him more paranoid, causes him to repress more, and just exacerbates this information problem and prevents him from finding out about and resolving issues before they spiral out of control. And what I find is that law and courts help rulers with this aptly named dictator's dilemma. And in doing so, I argue they help stabilize the regime. So I focus specifically on the Central Asian dictatorship of Kazakhstan, highlighted here in red near Russia and China. And when I arrived there to conduct exploratory research on a different project, I was very surprised to discover that ordinary citizens and state officials were regularly turning to civil courts to address conflicts with one another. And this was unexpected because everything I had read in the literature before I arrived suggested this was the least likely kind of place to see these sorts of citizen-state suits. So Kazakhstan is a personalist dictatorship that's been under the rule of President Nursultan Nazarbayev since the country's independence at the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991. And just to give you an idea of how authoritarian this regime is, he won the last election with some 98% of the vote. And over the past 2.5+ decades that he's been in power, has effectively silenced really any kind of viable opposition. And his rule, like that of most personalist dictators, is neo-patrimonial in nature, which is to say that while the framework of a legal, rational state a la Weber exists. In practice, those formal rules are very often ignored in favor of informal ties of patronage that rely on personal loyalty. So as a result, legal institutions often seem rather toothless when it comes to those who are politically well-connected. So it's therefore puzzling why citizens would turn to these institutions for recourse against these state officials who are politically well-connected in order to have that position. And in particular, regional and local executives, which are both sort of confusingly known as hakims, depend on informal ties to the president for their appointment. So regional hakims, which are akin to state governors in the US, are appointed directly by the president. And local district level hakims are akin to county mayors, if counties had mayors, and they're appointed by their regional superiors. And the judicial system is, if anything, more dependent on the executive. So judges at every level, down to the district level, so down to the county level in the entire country, are appointed by the president and serve at his pleasure. So in other words, this is not a system where courts enjoy any kind of independence. They don't provide opportunities for possibly carving out space free from overt regime control. And on the regime side of things, while a need for foreign direct investment has been found to drive the development of judicial systems in especially commercial courts in places like Singapore and China, Kazakhstan derives most of its wealth from oil and mineral exports. So FDI doesn't really explain why the regime is turning to courts, and it especially doesn't explain it in civil disputes with ordinary people. So think of your Aunt Sue who lives in a suburb of Chicago and really lacks any financial or political clout. These are the kinds of people who are going to court. In addition, Kazakhstan is really corrupt. So Transparency International's Corruption Perceptions Index ranks it 131st out of 175 countries for its level of corruption. And in a national survey by the same organization, courts were ranked the second most corrupt institution after the police. And outside of the court system, corruption often takes the form of expropriation by local officials, by these hakims, which understandably generates conflict between them and the citizens they target. And land seizure by state officials, purportedly for the purposes of public needs or eminent domain, is a particularly ostry vapros, which is to say it's a particularly contentious and political question that you would least expect ordinary citizens to take to court. And so it's the example that I focus on throughout the remainder of this talk. Yet, despite these three factors and a pretty darn strong security service with the ability to use force to expropriate, many of the conflicts that result from, for example, these land seizures are settled in civil courts. Now, I would show you a picture of one of the hearings that I attended, but all electronic devices were seized before going into the courtroom, so forgive me, but you'll have to make do with this slide. But if I could show you, you would see what I did, right? Which is that lots of people were actually going to court. These cases weren't just appearing on paper or on the court schedule, but representatives of the Hakimat, which is the administration of the hakims, showed up, and so did the citizens and their representatives when they had them. Now, it's puzzling why citizens would turn to courts that are widely acknowledged to be corrupt and dependent on the regime to tackle problems with the regime. And I found that the answer was you might be this guy. So you might be this lone property owner whose home is still standing in the midst of all these really lovely new high-rise condos that are quite expensive. But far more commonly, you might be someone who received higher compensation than what you were from the court than what you were initially offered by the local hakim. But then what I really wanted to know was what the dictator stood to gain by using courts for these citizen-state disputes. So, in other words, why is the dictator investing in civil courts, especially in disputes between citizens, ordinary everyday citizens, and the state, when this seems to be a really redundant step? Why not just, for example, take the land? And what does this tell us more broadly about the role of formal legal institutions, so law and courts, in authoritarian governance? And by invest, I refer to expending significant resources, financial, labor, time in the judicial system. So for example, why build the shiny new courthouse pictured here in Kazakhstan's capital, Astana, and why use it so regularly? So this isn't just window dressing. They are actually taking these suits to court. This building's quite busy all the time. Again, I would have taken a closer photo, but I didn't want to make this a talk about criminal process, so I took the photo from the highway, and you get a nice view of the step as well. But this kind of investment is really puzzling, right? Because courts are a costly way for the dictator to impose rules. And if they actually function as we think of courts functioning, they would tie the administration's hands, which is something that most personalist dictators in particular try very hard to avoid. After all, they rule through these top-down patron-client networks where allowing subordinates to use their position to line their own pockets is an informal, quote-unquote, perk that helps ensure their loyalty. So why invest in an institution that could possibly restrain this sort of beneficial, for the dictator, rent-seeking? And what I argue is that courts help dictators like President Nazarbayev govern by helping him manage the costs and consequences of relying on this sort of corruption to rule. And the primary way in which they do so is by monitoring state officials. So in other words, they serve as a discovery mechanism. They help address this problem that dictators have in getting accurate information, this dictator's dilemma. And they do so first by providing information about state officials' rent-seeking activity. So in the running example of this presentation, expropriation, and also citizens' responses to it. Second, courts reduce the threat of collective action or protests that can emerge in response to officials' actions by individualizing some types of disputes, like those over mass land seizures. And this makes any kind of collective response far more difficult. Not impossible, but far more difficult. But in serving these purposes, courts sometimes actually constrain the state, albeit minimally, because for either of these first two functions to work, courts sometimes have to provide meaningful relief to citizens in order to motivate their participation, because these are civil suits. There's no one showing up to drag them to court, even if it's a case filed against them by the state. If courts don't provide this meaningful relief, then the information the regime gets is still going to be subject to the dictator's dilemma. So this argument has implications for both governance and development. It stabilizes the regime by addressing the dictator's dilemma and making collective action more difficult and thus unlikely. And investment in formal legal institutions doesn't necessarily denote a commitment to eliminating corruption and investing in rule of law, but rather to limiting its scope to fit the dictator's preferences, which from the outside can look very much like a dysfunctional state or weak rule of law, but in actuality, it's a deliberate strategy of governance. Now, with respect to development, and here I'm speaking more specifically about expropriation, this sort of use of courts generates relative efficiency. So it's better than local officials simply running amok and taking absolutely everything. But it still strongly favors those with connections to the regime. And I'll talk about this in more detail a little later in the talk. But it is less efficient than secure property rights for all. And it exacerbates inequality by further concentrating valuable resources in the hands of those closely connected to the state, which has potential, which as Wash and others tell us, has potential long-term consequences for regime stability. And finally, using formal legal institutions in this way may, over the long term, generate expectations that law and courts really do matter, and cause them to become focal points for resistance to the favoritism shown to regime insiders. So dictators in neo-patrimonial regimes really rely on a vertically organized patron-client network, a sort of power vertical, in order to rule, which often involves allowing subordinates to use their positions to line their own pockets. So in effect, we see a kind of institutionalized corruption or rent-seeking throughout the state. But contrary to how we often think of corruption, this kind of predatory behavior isn't necessarily counter to the autocrat's interests. So it's actually part of how they rule. But at the same time, it doesn't necessarily mean that the dictator wants to hand them a carte blanche to steal whatever and however much they want. So Olson tells us that dictators will have incentives once they've gained control of a state to act as stationary bandits, which is to say that they limit how much they steal over the short term in order to increase their take over the longer term. So this occurs through self-interest. But his theory focuses on the executive, right? And even highly centralized dictatorships, Kazakhstan included, and like their democratic counterparts, have regional and local governments. And as Marcus, Gansmorse, and others have found, it's actually these clients of the dictator, these local governments, who pose the greatest threat of corruption, especially expropriation. And the autocrat, the dictator, doesn't want his agents' rent-seeking to impinge on his priorities, which include implementing policy and maintaining control over not only the population, but also the central budget. So over the dispersion of these patronage resources. So this implies management of some sort. The dictator needs a way to first monitor and then control local officials' corrupt behavior. So the question is, how do they do so? And the literature actually tells us very little about how this occurs in personalist dictatorships. So there's been a lot of recent research on political parties and local or parliamentary elections in authoritarian regimes that partially addresses this problem, but and it's been shown that these things help autocrats with dealing with these kinds of governance issues, including the information problem they have. But many authoritarian regimes, including the one we're talking about today, don't have local elections or strong ruling parties. So this vein in the literature actually tells us very little about how personalist dictatorships detect and manage subordinates' rent-seeking activity. And so what I argue is that the dictator requires local officials to funnel disputes through the civil court in order to enhance monitoring. law communicates a floor or a minimum for possible outcomes that all but the most powerful elites are expected to follow. And I argue this elsewhere in the project and would be happy to discuss it in Q&A. But in other words, for the vast majority of thousands of state officials, the rules do matter. But at the same time, there are conflicting or vague legal statutes that provide flexibility, that allows for rent seeking while technically remaining within the law. And civil cases that go through the court system then provide information about which officials are bad at corruption. So those who violate this minimum, or whose rent seeking otherwise violates the dictator's preferences, or who generate too much resentment among citizens. Because after all, as Magaloni tells us, coercion is expensive. So dictators do need some degree of cooperation. And courts are particularly useful because they can identify specific officials and areas that might be problematic. And moreover, because there are open appeals, they provide a measure of degree. So if you're really pissed off about something and you don't get the outcome you want in court, you're going to appeal, right? So there's a great deal of information that's being provided. And consensual participation is crucial here, right? Because otherwise the information will be subject to the same dictator's dilemma. So the regime has this incentive to offer improved outcomes for some individuals. Citizens will be more likely to participate because civil cases aren't necessarily an indictment of the regime or even of the official. Instead, they're seeking compliance with the law that the dictator himself created, and they're aware of that. And under whose control the courts also operate. And in addition to providing valuable information about potentially problematic officials, courts give the autocrat insight into these potential situations or areas that may cause trouble. And so if this argument's correct, there's several observable implications. So courts help monitor local officials' rent seeking. We could see this, excuse me. So there are several observable implications. So if courts are used to monitor and manage subordinates, there should be evidence that this is actually a top-down policy. It's not an initiative of a few local officials here and there, right? So there should be relative consistency in how cases are and processes are handled across regions. Presumably, if the courts are being used to monitor local officials and monitor them engaging in corrupt activity, they're probably not going to be thrilled about it. So resistance to citizens actually participating in court. The most obvious observable implications, however, are evidence of monitoring, so that tracks cases, costs, outcomes, and consequences for those who violate the rules. And the second part of my argument is that courts individualize what begin as shared grievances, which reduces the likelihood of collective action. So especially in these particular land disputes over eminent domain, there are interconnected neighborhoods that are having just huge chunks of the neighborhood seized. And these are neighbors who've known one another for decades. Everyone knows everyone else's business. And there's a high degree of trust. So this increases the potential for collective action or protest, which is threatening to the regime's image of stability, harmony, and control. But using force in every single one of these little conflicts would undermine that narrative. So the court funnels those with grievances through the court, or the regime funnels those with grievances through the courts in a kind of divide and disperse strategy. There are several steps in the judicial process. You have to make a decision whether you're going to go to court or not. If you're unhappy with the outcome, you have to decide whether you want to spend the time and the effort and the money to appeal, or do you give up, and then do you fight even further on? And because courts have multiple instances, and in civil law systems like Kazakhstan's, each case is decided individually rather than depending on precedent. So here in the US, if the Supreme Court or an appeals court makes a decision, the lower courts have to pay attention to that decision. In a civil system, it's based on the law that's on the books. So individuals have a chance at receiving a favorable outcome. And you can think of this as akin to playing the slots at the casino. So most people who go play the slots know that the odds are stacked against them. The odds are in favor of the house, right? But they also know that there's some chance that they could win big, and they're really hoping they at least come out ahead. So people go through the system individually, however, because there are no class action suits. This makes it difficult to coordinate over a collective grievance because many people who gamble at the slot machines, want to take the chance that their situation will be the one that's improved. And they're reluctant to protest while the case is ongoing because, remember, this is a dictatorship, and the threat of arrest or detention, the risks associated with doing that are quite high. So what happens is that people who take this route, as they go through the system, get tired, but they get tired at different intervals. Their cases are heard at different intervals. And they start to drop off one by one, which makes it really difficult to coordinate a protest. So if I'm correct, there are several, again, observable implications, right? There should actually be the potential for protest. People should express that they're willing to protest. And if they actually do manage to do so, those protests are treated as a threat, even if they're small scale. In part because, again, this damages the image of stability, and also in part because mass protests can emerge very quickly, and it's hard to know when something's going to reach a tipping point and escalate. For both this function of disruption and for the discovery mechanism, courts really need to serve as a clearinghouse for information and for these people who might otherwise engage in protests. So when they attempt other strategies other than going to court, because that's rarely anyone's first choice, they should be diverted into the judicial system. And then, of course, as people go through the court system, they should gradually drop off, and the protest potential should diminish. Now, in evaluating this theory, I draw on data that was collected during over a year of field work in Kazakhstan's 3 largest urban areas: Astana, the capital, in the north; Almaty, which is the commercial capital and former capital, in the southeast; and Shymkent, which is the southern capital. And I did over 100 semi-structured interviews with relevant individuals, which included attorneys, state officials, landowners, appraisers, NGO experts, etc. Those with state officials and attorneys were primarily contacted through cold calling, through information that was publicly available. Landowners, because this was such a sensitive subject, were contacted through snowball sampling and through personal networks. In addition, I engaged in ethnographic observation of 24 district and then several appeals court cases on eminent domain in the capital, Astana, and spent time in 2 neighborhoods where there were ongoing legal battles over expropriation, as well as in some suburbs of Almaty and Shymkent. So for the civil processes, I did have to notify the court that I would be attending. These processes are open to the public. but even though the court knew there was a possibility I might attend in this few-month range, I tried to make it very random when I showed up, and the judges never had more than about 5 minutes notice when I did so. And this was based on written notes since I couldn't have recording devices in the courtroom. So I then used this information to develop a survey that was fielded in all 3 urban areas and their bordering suburban districts. This was a random sample stratified by district population. Now, to evaluate the theory, well, I did a 2-stage mixed method approach. And the first was investigative, which is to say there's not a lot of publicity surrounding these disputes. So before I developed an answer to my question or tested it, I had to figure out what was actually going on. So I conducted interviews in all 3 regions of the study. Then I spent the second part of field work testing the hypotheses, testing these observable implications of the theory that I had developed. So this is the point in the field work where I did all the ethnographic observation, as well as the bulk of interviews with attorneys and landowners, and conducted the survey which looked at protest potential. So what I found is that basically the dictator is a stationary bandit, right? So even though he has access to all this oil money, to all these resource rents, those rents aren't unlimited, and the bulk of them go towards making him and his cronies, his inner circle, rich, right? And so he needs to exert some level of control over the central budget and avoid siphoning off of these funds by all these local and regional officials. And so he needs to do this in order to maintain control over the entire system. But the most cost-efficient way of doing this is to allow lower-level clients to benefit financially from their appointments, from their positions. A primary way, again, how this occurs among the Hakims is through eminent domain. So this seizure of private land for supposedly public needs. So local officials have extensive authority over land rights, and although the purposes for which land can be seized are relatively well defined by law, there's also quite a bit of flexibility and ambiguity in the law that gives them a chance to earn rents while technically staying within legal bounds. So to give you an example of that, there are no real restrictions on how much land is seized for a particular public works project. So in one neighborhood where I spent time, half the neighborhood was seized to build 1 kindergarten. As one of the respondents there told me, you could build enough kindergartens to house all the children in this city in the land that they seized, right? And so the leftover land was then resold to developers at, one would imagine, a substantial premium that went into the Hakim's pockets. So at the same time, short time horizons help motivate this behavior. So like many authoritarian regimes, in Kazakhstan, these officials are circulated regularly to keep them from building up local bases of support and to keep them loyal to the central regime. So they're trying to steal as much as they can while they're in a particular place. This means they have an interest when it comes to expropriation in getting it done quickly, right? So it's a little bit, this would imply that they don't want to go to court, right? Because court processes take a long time, and that makes it sort of surprising that it's most often these same local officials who are filing the cases against local citizens. But this actually makes sense in terms of my argument, right? So if this is imposed from above, that the autocrat the dictator is using courts to manage rent seeking. They would be taking these disputes to court as a result of a centrally imposed policy. So indeed, this is one of the observable implications that I introduced earlier, and we see the same automatic filing of disputes by local officials in all three regions, which are very distinct culturally and economically, and similar rulings in court as well. So a really key moment was a comment that an appeals court judge made in which she was citing top-down guidance specifically related to eminent domain disputes. So the land code and the Constitution stipulate that landowners should get, or property owners should get, equivalent compensation for their property, so market value. But in this case, and in most of the cases, the statute that was applied, which is lower in the legal hierarchy and thus should not trump the Constitution or the land code, it says that the price offered has to be the last purchase or sale price of the property, even if that was in 1989 and it was nothing, right? So this is the statute that's most often applied. Obviously, people are generally pretty unhappy about that. And the appeals court said, look, there's basically no point in you arguing this. We've been issued guidance on this from above. We have to apply this particular statute. You just take what you're going to get and leave. So in addition, there were multiple interviewees in all three regions that recounted stories of meetings of the general prosecutor, who's a very powerful official in most post-Soviet states, including Kazakhstan, where he was saying, you need to apply that law on compensation, right? In addition, again, we should expect that local officials, if courts are being used to monitor and manage them, maybe aren't too thrilled about that. They're not going to be happy about going to court, so we might expect to see some kind of resistance. So this is, again, what I found. Landowners who decided to go to court rather than accept the proffered compensation had their homes vandalized. One family got the largest guard dog I've ever seen to guard their house against vandals who they claimed were coming from the Akimat, from the Akim's administration. In another case, a man's pregnant wife was forcibly hospitalized. They both claimed she was perfectly healthy, and this was done in order to separate them and pressure them into caving on the case. But of course, if the regime is really using courts to monitor corruption, there should be some kind of extensive reports. And usually finding this information in a dictatorship is rather difficult. So very recently, this is something that I came across just this past week, so I'm just beginning to work with this particular set of data. The Kazakhstani government started releasing far more detailed statistics about civil cases. And these really reflect the emphases we would expect if the central regime is concerned about tracking state officials' rent seeking. So police and courts are by far the two sectors most cited as being corrupt by citizens, and the court data don't reflect this at all. Instead, they emphasize those government officials and agencies whose actions have a direct impact on the dispersion or collection of funds that are destined for or coming from the central budget. And the two with the highest number of cases are the tax authorities and the local executive governments, the Akims. Again, these data weren't available when I began my research, so my choice to focus on local executives was based on what I was seeing on court schedules. But as you can see here, the number of cases between tax officials and local executives are quite close. So these categories don't add up to 100%. So this is a selective approach to record keeping that suggests an emphasis on particular officials and agencies. There's one caveat that there are categories of cases including eminent domain, which is listed here in gray for that reason, that are by definition citizen-state cases. Eminent domain cases are always between citizens and the state, and it isn't clear whether the local executives number above it includes these cases or whether it's separate, and that's something that I will be following up on when I return to the field. But which category they fall in matters, I argue, less than the emphasis that having a separate and detailed analysis of citizen-state cases, so this is an entirely separate major category in the data and how it's organized, that's focused on this collection and dispersion of revenues. So in other words, the organization of the data reflects these central priorities of tracking officials' rent seeking and its costs. So in particular, one of the subcategories in this category of citizen-state cases is how much the disputes cost the central budget and how much was returned to the central budget by court order. Now, while this data is suggestive, it doesn't necessarily on its own demonstrate that the central regime differentiates among different approaches to corruption. So the smoking gun on that was actually when I was lucky enough to be passed a copy of an internal report, an internal audit from the General Prosecutor's Office on eminent domain cases. And what it detailed was really interesting. So it detailed not just the regions with the most court cases concerning eminent domain, but really emphasized over and over how much the state, so how much had been spent from the central budget on land seizures. So the central Republican budget provides funds to local governments to reimburse landowners for land that's seized for public works projects, especially things like infrastructure development. So it was how much was spent on these seizures, how much was spent on litigation and compensation, and it was really concerned with these budgetary losses. In particular, there was one section that stood out where there were photos of plots of empty steppe that had been bought for millions of dollars, and next to it, photos of these luxury cottages, which are actually, confusingly, mansions in the local context, that you could buy in the capital city for the same price. So it was really railing over and over against this excess spending in these categories. And it also lists the number of criminal cases that came out of these civil cases. So this included charges against state officials. Unfortunately, the information it provided wasn't particularly detailed, so it didn't list the names of the officials, for example. But it does confirm that those who step out of line with central prerogatives, so especially those who were engaging in these sorts of schemes to inflate the value of land to really high prices to get more money from in compensation, that they're subject to some kind of sanctions. And indeed, there have been arrests and dismissal or reshuffling of state officials connected to scandals over the overpayment of compensation. So this has really been a target of the central government. And there are also recommendations, and this is where it gets really interesting. So there's recommendations about how to address what the report finds. So namely, again, the drain on the central budget and instances where individuals didn't get any compensation at all. So the local government is supposed to provide them with something, and they got nothing. Which goes back to my point about the law providing a floor. So this statute that really values land very low, nonetheless, they're supposed to get at least that amount for the land. So this is where local executives violated legal minimums, and indeed judges took the Akimat to task in court. In one case I attended, the appeals judge threatened to open an administrative case against this state official for not paying any compensation to a particular landowner for her garage that was seized. But what there's not any mention of is the fact that compensation is usually well below what's legally stipulated in the Land Code and the Constitution, or calls to reconcile this law that's used to rule in favor of much lower compensation with these higher level legal documents. And even more interesting, there aren't any recommendations or even really any mention of the very common practice of land seizures for commercial purposes. So this happens all the time, and it's really obvious. If you think back to that picture I showed you of the little house and the big skyscrapers, that land was all seized for eminent domain. It's all apartment buildings that are not state-owned. So it's purposefully ignoring this very common type of rent seeking while targeting another that drains the central budget. So in other words, what we see is that courts are helping manage corruption without installing rule of law, if we think of rule of law in terms of equality before the law. But at the same time, that doesn't mean there aren't rules. And this is interesting because so often corruption is spoken of in very sweeping terms, and it's attributed to a lack of state capacity, weak rule of law. But here it's actually a deliberate strategy of governance, and the state's differentiating between kinds of corruption. So the second part of my argument, again, is that courts help disperse the potential for protest. So for that to occur, there needs to be the potential for protests to begin with. And I got at this implication through my survey work. So I gave respondents a vignette about a hypothetical cousin who had their land seized by the Akimat for pennies on the dollar, and then they were asked to give him some advice. And they were given the options that you see here. They could choose as many or as few options as they wanted. 97% chose at least one option, and on average there were 3 options chosen. Over half, so one of these options was to try and organize a protest, and over half chose that as their first or second choice strategy. 22% chose it as their first choice strategy. And this was actually higher in the 2 bigger cities, Astana and Almaty. So this points to a surprisingly high potential for protest. Now, of course, those who actually end up protesting, like the people pictured here in a photo from Radio Free Europe, is quite low. And that's in large part because courts help divide and dissipate those groups who are predisposed to collective action. So as we would expect, if the regime is concerned with protests, when they do occur, they're treated as a threat. So participants are arrested or detained, or there's force used to break up protests. One neighborhood I followed applied for a permit for a Mirnaya Sobrania, which is like a peaceful protest, and their permit was denied. And when they tried to resolve their differences with the Akimat in using other means, so primarily by writing letters to the financial police, to the president, to the procureur, the prosecutor's office, all their letters, and this is across 3 distinct neighborhoods that had no contact with one another, all their letters were rerouted back to the same Akim who they were upset with in the first place. And they were across the board told, look, if you don't like it, go to court. So among those who refused the compensation, they ended up having court cases filed against them. So I was lucky enough to be able to follow one neighborhood for close to a year. And in this neighborhood, there were 36 homes seized for roadway expansion. And actually, these were fairly large plots, so a lot of homeowners were like, hey, can we just move our house back and lose the part of our land that's going to go under the road? That didn't happen. Their request was denied. And so they faced an initial decision. Do they take what the Akimat's offering them, or do they go to court? And 31 of them went to district court. They were really incensed. They wrote a letter to the president saying, look, we're going to go to any ends to defend our land. This is ridiculous. We paid this much money for it, and we're getting nothing. And the phrase again and again was, we want equivalent compensation for our land. They weren't too happy with the result in district court. No one got higher compensation. They even compared the process to the Inquisition, so it sounded pretty unpleasant. And so this is the point where we really see quite a few people drop off. About half of those who went to district court said that they were just tired. They were going to take what they could while they could get it. But over half did appeal their decisions. They said, well, we hope that this judge listens to us. The others who, unfortunately, I wasn't able to talk to because their neighbors said they were afraid to speak with me, said they were afraid to go to court. The Akimat was putting pressure on them, saying you'll get less money. They'd given up hope. They decided to cut their losses and leave it. And so this group of people who are really incensed and pushing and were trying to organize this protest starts to shrink. And it really shrinks by the time they got done with the appeals process. So only 5 of these people applied to the Supreme Court. And this included the leaders who were trying to organize the protest in the first place. Those who were really trying to get their neighbors together and protest. They said, well, we're taking our efforts to the courts. We're going to see this through to the end. The rest decided it was useless. And so what we see over the course of these different court processes is that people drop off bit by bit. By the end here, they said, we're tired. We don't want to deal with this anymore. And not only was it effective in dispersing, and even the person who was trying to organize the protest ended up saying this by the end. But of this whole group from this neighborhood, it was not only effective in dispersing these attempts at collective action, it physically dispersed them. So the amount of compensation that they received for their homes was so little that all but 2 of them decided they couldn't remain in Astana and moved elsewhere. So this was in this neighborhood, an exceptionally effective strategy. So in conclusion, autocrats have their clients, have their subordinates, funnel cases of citizen-state conflict through civil courts in order to get information about officials, individuals, and issues that could be problematic, and then uses that information to address them elsewhere. And they used courts as well to disperse the potential for protests on a highly sensitive political issue that was able to attract significant public sympathy. So these are people's homes, and there's a lot of sympathy for those who are simply not receiving really anything for them, so potentially damaging to the regime's image. But for courts to do this, they need at least quasi-voluntary participation. So they can't be dragging people in by the arm with the security services, because then the information ends up being subject to the same dictator's dilemma. People just have an incentive to lie. So that motivates the regime to sometimes have courts rule that in ways that favor ordinary citizens. So that it's sort of, to go back to the casino example, no one would go play the slot machines if no one ever won. What would be the point? But if you know you've got a chance, you're maybe willing to give it a try. So in other words, in an effort to consolidate authoritarianism and regulate corruption, we see the beginnings of a very thin system of rule of law, which is the antithesis of both. But over the long term, relying on legal institutions in this way can generate expectations that law and courts really do matter, and not necessarily in the way that the dictator intended. And in addition, tacitly allowing these kinds of seizures to continue to occur means that very valuable property is becoming increasingly concentrated in the hands of those with close ties to the regime. So this exacerbates inequality, which could potentially have consequences for overall regime stability. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
I have the microphone, so if you could just wait until I carry over the mic to ask the question.
Thank you. That gave rise to many potential questions. I was looking at your list of civil cases of state, of individuals suing the state. And I noticed that the most common category was tax cases. Mm-hmm. And of course you focused on eminent domain, but it seems that people were less intimidated by making a tax challenge to the government mm-hmm. than by an eminent domain challenge. But I also noticed that you have prisoners' rights down here, and that category is included even though there are no such cases. So mm-hmm. apparently incarceration is pretty effective because the prisoners don't think that there's any hope if they go to court. All right, those both concern me, but the other issue is when you were surveying people, what did they know about the surveyors? Did they know that they were Americans? Would that have skewed the results by encouraging people to say that protest was their first choice?
That's an excellent question. I can't completely rule out that possibility, but the survey was carried out by a local survey team. And while it was mentioned that this was part of a research project from, and they said my name and my university, that was the extent to which it was mentioned that this was, carried out by an American. It was, and I attended, I went along with the survey team when they did some of their interviews, and I didn't say anything. I learned to blend in fairly well, and the interviewers didn't mention that I was American. I sat there sort of quietly and observed, and people really didn't seem to pick up on the name and university connection. So I'm reasonably, while I can't completely rule it out, I'm reasonably confident that that really wasn't an issue.
We have a question over here.
Oh, sorry.
We have a question.
Thank you. Thanks, Margaret, for this really interesting talk. I was wondering if you could talk to us more about the judges and what are the, how are they appointed and what are their motivations? Are they receiving, I think at one point you mentioned they're receiving some direction from central authority about mm-hmm. how they should be ruling on things, but just wondering if you could talk more about the judges.
Sure, that's a really good question, and it's one I could actually talk about for quite a while, but I'll try and keep this reasonably short. The answer to that is well, first and foremost, their appointment is at the pleasure of the president. There are no set terms, life terms, anything like that. The Supreme Court justices do have to be have some support from the legislature, but that legislature is just stacked with the president's party, so that doesn't really mean anything. And there are multiple overlapping systems that are in place that really help ensure judges comply with central directives. So not only are they appointed by the president, each court has a chairperson who is responsible for all the other judges in their court. And so that person has an incentive to monitor for the larger system, because if they screw up and do something that the central regime doesn't like, they get in trouble. The open appeals process also factors into that. So I actually had appeals court judges tell me, hey, our job is to monitor the work of the lower courts. And then the next court up is in charge of monitoring the appeals courts. So there's these overlapping mechanisms. In addition, there's the institution of the procuror, which is the prosecutor. They sit in on about 2/3, according to this new data that I found, on about 2/3 of cases that involve state interests. So there's another institution watching the courts. So there's basically all these overlapping mechanisms that ensure that courts are very afraid to do anything that's not centrally endorsed. If that makes sense.
I just had two quick questions. The first one being that you mentioned how autocracies that depend on foreign direct investment need to have courts with at least a degree of legitimacy, and I was just wondering why that is the case. And then the second question is, do you know if we see consistency between this relationship between collective action and the presence of like semi-legitimate court systems within these autocracies?
Okay, let me address the first question. So a link between FDI and legitimacy. Well, my point was a little more broad, actually, that courts in general, if they're going to attract willing participants, need to have some degree of legitimacy. With respect to foreign direct investment, what's been found in China and Singapore is that basically investors get really upset if they have no forum for dispute resolution. And they can have a great deal of leverage, especially with regional governments. Well, not in Singapore, but in China. And so they pressure them into providing more neutral arbitration. So for example, in Singapore, the commercial courts actually have a really excellent reputation for providing impartial decisions, and that increases businesses' willingness to invest there, because they know that if, let's say, some local official decides to inspect them and like levy all kinds of fines or something like that, they have a means to resolve that dispute that's going to be impartial. Could you repeat your second question again?
Do you know, like, if we see consistency between the relationship between collective action and the prevalence of courts across other autocracies besides Kazakhstan?
That's a great question. I would love to have the data to be able to answer it. But generally speaking, dictatorships aren't particularly forthcoming with information that would help us resolve that. It's something I'll be poking into a little more as much as I can, but I don't have a really good answer for you on that one.
So I really loved this, but I'm trying to think of a way to argue with it. And what comes to mind is that you've kind of made the case about how a functioning judicial system is functional for a dictator or any regime. But there's also bits of literature I can think of from around the world basically arguing that it's down to the collective action or the political influence of the judicial system, that lawyers or chambers of lawyers, have some agency to direct argument in their ways against, say, informal negotiations with the public administration. And you've spoken at length about how the judges don't fight the government politically, but is there any of this sort of agency on the part of the legal system that might help explain it?
That's a great question. Yes and no. So there are attorneys associations there. They do raise a stink about things. Sometimes the particular statute that I kept talking about that calculates compensation at a ridiculously low level being one of them. There have been several articles that have come out saying that, like, this is unconstitutional, what the hell. But do they have any real power to sort of push back? I would say no, in large part because they're licensed by the Ministry of Justice, and there's one attorneys association, right? So it's not, for example, in Russia, there's different attorneys associations. This is an association that, even though they elect their own leadership, they're ultimately beholden to the Ministry of Justice, and a lot of them are basically afraid to push things too far because if they do, they'll lose their license and their ability to practice. I don't know if that answers your question sufficiently. Yep. Yes.
Thank you, Margaret. Really fascinating talk and really impressive project. So I have a question about citizens' motivation for going to court. So you said that courts are widely seen as corrupt and that the chance that a citizen will win in the court case is vanishingly small. So you made this analogy with the lottery. So it seems to me that for citizens to go to court, they need to be sure that they don't run any major risk. And so my question then, I guess, is what prevents these local officials from harassing people who go to court and raising the costs of going to court for them?
That's a good question. So the answer is they do harass them sometimes and raise the costs. But when I was speaking to landowners and the different strategies they can follow, the lowest risk strategy is trying to petition, sort of in old Soviet style, petition the president, petition the procureur, petition the financial police, and people do that, and that's the first step that they engage in, right? They take the lowest risk option. But then when it comes to sort of protest and going to court, protest is a lot higher risk because, you can be detained by the internal security services. It's really treated pretty harshly in most cases, even if you're one person with a picket sign. There have been multiple instances where that person has been dragged off to jail, so a group of people protesting is especially threatening, whereas going to court, yeah, you will probably be harassed by the local government, but it's not quite as risky as courts. So I think it comes down to risk calculations, if that makes sense.
I have a couple questions about sort of the threat of protest and the argument that the court is sort of channeling people away from protest into this other forum. It's obviously really difficult to measure protest potential when protests are not really occurring that much, as they are in Kazakhstan, but I was wondering if you have any comparison for the number that you gave that something like almost 50% of people would recommend to their cousin that they hold a protest. Is that in line with the national surveys on sort of the protest threat at the time? Do we have any information, some broader context for how much people are actually protesting? Because it's really costless and easy for people to recommend that their cousin go out hypothetically and protest. In reality, I think that's not happening that much in Kazakhstan. I was also hoping you could comment a little bit more on the idea that expropriation is a really high risk area, and people are going to organize these large protests that are going to, be really threatening to the regime. It seems to me like these are things that affect limited groups of people that don't scale well. It's not the kind of thing you're going to hook in 100,000 people who are sympathetic to your plight and you're going to occupy the square. It seems like the kind of thing where everyone in your neighborhood's really bummed. And it doesn't really aggregate that well. So compared to other things, there's a lot of strikes in Kazakhstan that are really disruptive. Is there any evidence that those events are being channeled into negotiation processes that would sort of support the claim that courts and protests are substitutes for each other in terms of getting satisfaction for your grievances, if that makes sense?
No, that makes sense. Okay, so in terms of the threat of protests, actually protests do happen in Kazakhstan and more frequently than we would think. There's some data that's going to be available soon that I'll be working with and be working on including in this project to address that concern. But right now I don't have a measure of how much people are actually protesting. It does occur though. Just in the span of a year and a half that I was in the field, there were at least, let's say about 6 to 10, I would have to check my notes, neighborhood-sized protests that occurred just specifically over land rights. So it's happening. Your point that expropriation really affects a limited group of people is a good one. I'm not particularly concerned about it for one, because the idea is not that this necessarily affects hundreds of thousands of people. It's that the regime is very keen on maintaining an image of stability and complete control, right? So to avoid even giving people sort of the hope that they can act out, right? This is a key way in which it maintains its hold on power. And so if you had lots and lots of these little protests, it's maybe not going to overthrow President Nazarbayev, but it disrupts that image of regime control and of stability. And it's also costly, right, to constantly have to throw in security forces to put down these protests. The protests, which were labor protests actually, which you mentioned at the end, that occurred in Zhanazoen, which I always pronounce wrong, in a few years ago, were really harshly put down. A lot of people died. This created, it wasn't a huge protest. It was substantial, but it wasn't huge. And the backlash after that happened was pretty severe in terms, judging by, it's hard to measure that, right? But judging by people's responses to the videos of the protest and whatnot on social media. And then this speaks to your third question or actually this still speaks to the second question about it being a local phenomenon. When there were proposed changes to the land code last year, it generated the largest mass protest that Kazakhstan has seen since independence. There were thousands of people protesting in multiple cities throughout the country. And the regime acted in a relatively restrained manner to these protests, even though they were quite large. And it's in part, I think, because there was so much backlash following all the killings that had happened a few years earlier. So they actually sort of let it happen. The president backstepped on the proposed changes, and then they quietly, a month later, arrested those who had organized the protests. So it's also, land is a very mobilizing and sensitive issue. And I think it's hard for dictators to tell when a small-scale protest can suddenly tip into something and explode into something larger, especially when it's a politically sensitive topic like land. And whether there's any connection, whether we see sort of moves to break up strikes in court, that's an interesting question. For the next part of this project, I'm going to be looking into other types of disputes, and that's certainly one that I'm going to consider. There have been some attempts to change legislation, for example, related to professional associations. That's been quite controversial, and I know there's been some litigation surrounding that. So that will be a next step in the project, so check back later.
We have time for maybe one more question. Is there one more question? Okay, well then please help me in thanking Margaret for her talk and answering all the questions.